Back to our top story now, and the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. For more discussion, I want to bring in Duncan Marsh, Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy. He's also a former U.S. climate change negotiator. He worked on the Kyoto Protocol, the predecessor to the Paris Agreement. A lot to get to here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be with you, Elaine.
Now, you have said in the past that the U.S. and China constitute the most important climate change relationship by far. What happens to this relationship?
Well, great question. I would say climate change and environmental issues in general have been a real highlight of the relationship over the last decade. And they've allowed the countries to go through some tough times on other issues, and they've also shown great moments of diplomacy between the countries. The two countries' relationship, I think, was key to getting the Paris Agreement elements in place in the first place and leading the rest of the world to bring them into that really important agreement. And Paris is an architecture that allows each country to choose its own pathway toward reducing emissions. In this regard, I think President Trump got it wrong today when he said the U.S. is compelled to do certain things. It chose its target, and every other country did as well, including China. As far as what's next with the U.S. and China, we'll see. I think this is going to be a bit of a stumbling block in the relationship, and maybe not just on climate change issues, but other issues as well.
This was an issue that a lot of countries, we saw the consensus with this Paris Climate Agreement. You know, Trump said a lot in his speech. He went after a lot of countries, China, India. Let's fact check this speech. Is there anything that he said that was perhaps taken out of context or that you take issue with?
Well, I would say it was more than just taken out of context in some places. Let me look at what he said about China and India. He said they don't have to do anything for 13 years until 2030. That's just factually incorrect. Each country has to take actions to put itself on a pathway to reducing emissions. And those countries have taken a step forward with significant commitments. They couldn't wait until 2030 to suddenly turn around their economies and try to reduce emissions to meet those targets. They're going to have to put in place those measures now, and they're already doing so, in fact. In both countries, I would say that their domestic programs actually are more ambitious than what they pledged in the Paris Agreement. So they should be able to do that. China's on path to reduce its emissions sooner than it said, and that's one example. He also cited some studies which were the real extreme end of the most drastic scenarios that the U.S. would have to place on its economy to reduce its emissions. They were funded by groups that opposed the Paris Agreement in the first place. So I would say he picked and chose his studies very liberally to back up the arguments he was making, and they were not balanced arguments.
As we get underway with this day, Premier Keqiang is in Brussels. He's meeting with EU leaders. What is that conversation going to be like at that summit?
Well, I think there's going to be much more solidarity between them as a result of the U.S. action. I think President Trump chose to put the U.S. in the back row of international climate diplomacy, on a range of issues for quite some time. And I think China will be very happy to step into that role, work with partners, and the EU will as well. And both sides have signaled real intent to A, preserve the Paris Agreement as it is, to maintain it, to not suggest that it needs to be renegotiated, but they've also signaled that they're ready to step into leadership. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what they have to say tomorrow and how this moves us forward.
You've been in the middle of these type of negotiations. How does the United States get back into the Paris Agreement if it steps out? Donald Trump says that is an unfair deal, that he wants to renegotiate. European leaders are already pushing back on that. So take us through what happens in 2020.
Right. So I think that that's a great question. And I think there's possibly an opening here. I don't know if it was intentional by Mr. Trump or not, but he indicated the U.S. was ready to renegotiate Paris or something else. Now, I think the structure of the Paris Agreement is not negotiable. That has already been ratified by 147 countries, so that's an existing body of international law, and I don't think there would be any appetite from other countries to renegotiate that architecture. That said, the U.S. target within it could conceivably be reviewed, and I think that there might be room for President Trump to review what he said, review what experts is telling him, consider the businesses, a number of American businesses that are in support of staying in this agreement and believe it's good for the U.S. economy to do so, and look at how the U.S. target might be revisited and brought to a place that he is comfortable with, and then reapproach the Paris the Paris Agreement from that angle, and thus allow the U.S. to stay in and maintain a diplomatic leadership role.
Your reaction in one word?
terrible, to be honest.
All right, Duncan Marsh, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.